Today marks the halfway point in our summer series on the story of Joseph. By this point in the story, Joseph has grown up quite a bit. We started when he was a teen boy, annoying his big brothers. And by the end of today's chapter, he's going to be a 30-year-old who's on top of the world, or at least on top of Egypt. Not only that, but he has grown into someone who even the Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, can see is filled with God's Spirit. But how did he get there? Well, like we all tend to do at big moments in life, the end of the school year, high school graduation, milestone ages, we're going to look back on Joseph's journey so far. I'm sure we've probably all had those moments where we look back and think how much we've learned since a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And I think one of the most intense times of change and growth in life is young adulthood. So I can imagine 30-year-old Joseph in today's chapter looking back at 17-year-old Joseph feeling like a whole different person. And I can speak from experience because this year I turned 31, just a little bit older than Joseph. And when I look back to 17-year-old Rachel and all the things she thought she had figured out, it's wild to think about what I've learned and how God has worked through my life since then. And although my siblings didn't throw me in a pit, there are definitely some parallels with Joseph's story and my own. And so today you get a bit of a 2-for-1. If you're struggling to concentrate through Joseph's story, remember that after that you get to see some maybe embarrassing pictures of 17-year-old Rachel. So it's a good reason to pay attention, if Joseph isn't enough of a reason. Because Joseph and I are both dreamers whose hearts were changed by how God worked in our circumstances. So let's get started. First, at 17, Joseph was the spoiled dreamer. He was his dad's favorite, and everyone knew it. And he tattled on his older brothers, which reinforced that favoritism. He had special dreams, but seemed convinced they were about elevating himself, making him sound more important. Then Joseph's brothers stepped in and threw him not only into a pit, but also into a new phase of his life and his identity. That was when he became Joseph the good slave. He was sold to Ishmaelite traders, traveled. I noticed that Fran shared this stat, except she shared it in miles, and I'm sharing it in kilometers. So over 800 kilometers to Egypt to be sold to Potiphar, an Egyptian official. But God was still with Joseph and must have begun to work in his heart on the journey, because we see him start to change. Instead of the brat who lorded his position over his hardworking brothers, Joseph proves himself to be hardworking and trustworthy in Potiphar's house. So his hard work and God's favor get him promoted to be Potiphar's second in command, running his whole house. Have you ever experienced the growth that's possible when you're in a tough season? Some people will say that the hardships we face are God-given so that we can learn and grow. It's been mentioned in previous sermons this summer that a lot of harm has been done when that sort of logic gets used against those who are in the midst of hardship. Sometimes the idea can get twisted to portray God like a puppet master pushing us into suffering just to teach us a lesson. So I want to reframe that a bit for us today. I think that God is always giving us chances to learn, every single day. Every day is a chance to grow into who God created you to be. And God would probably be just as happy for us to learn and grow on happy days and wonderful seasons. But I think that at least some of it is that we get in our own way. Because most of us, myself included, save the big questions and the reflection and the searching that tends to lead to growth for times when everything has fallen apart. When everything's hunky-dory, we're just cruising, not asking any questions. But when everything falls apart, when we're in the pit, that's when we take the time to learn those lessons. It's easier to learn from the pit because we're forced to take the time. So speaking of everything falling apart, Joseph's next phase is Joseph the prisoner. He finds himself unjustly thrown into his next pit, the Pharaoh's prison. But just as it was when he was sold as a slave, we get this phrase in the verse, "The Lord was with Joseph." So again, Joseph rises to a position of leadership, this time becoming the second in command to the guy in charge of the prison. And while he's in prison, with lots of time and no place to go, he steps into another new part of his identity. Joseph, the dream interpreter. Not only does Joseph step into leadership while he's in prison, he also learns to tap into a gift that God placed in him years before. He's not the one dreaming anymore, but he is the one God uses to help the cupbearer and baker understand the meaning of their dreams. He says to the two men, "Interpreting dreams is God's business, but go ahead and tell me your dreams." And by God's Spirit, he is able to tell them the meaning. And this is what eventually gives Joseph his biggest opportunity yet, which is today's chapter. In some ways, it's the culmination of all of Joseph's life phases, all of his journey so far. Because just before this, when Joseph predicts that the cupbearer will get out of prison and get his job back, Joseph says, please tell Pharaoh about me. And after 2 years of waiting, finally something reminds the cupbearer to mention Joseph to Pharaoh. And it's Pharaoh's 2 disturbing dreams that no one can figure out. Pharaoh is distraught, upset about what these dreams might mean. And so he's desperate enough that he will even take the recommendation to ask a guy who's been in his prison for years. Verse 14. Do I have it up there? Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I have heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it." Joseph's response in the next verse, I think, is one of the biggest ways that you can tell he has learned and grown and changed in the 13 years from where we meet him. Verse 16. "It is beyond my power to do this," Joseph replied, "but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease." So where Joseph, the spoiled dreamer, that annoying 17-year-old bugging his brothers, might have taken credit for his ability, might have used it to make himself look impressive or to get in Pharaoh's good books, Joseph, the humble wise man, immediately points to God's power in the situation. He doesn't claim to be anything special. It's kind of like he's saying, "I'm just the messenger." And where young Joseph's bragging got him thrown into a pit by his own brothers, this time his humble desire to be helpful has the opposite result. Joseph tells Pharaoh the meaning of his dreams and gives him wise advice for how to survive the coming famine. Joseph says, "Therefore, Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt." It would have been very easy for him to say, "Pharaoh should put me in charge because I am so smart and I will take care of everything. Just give me all the power." But instead, he just gives Pharaoh what wisdom he hears from God. And the result of this humble approach is that Pharaoh does catapult Joseph to the top. He does step into a position of power, but not by trying to grab it. No, Pharaoh says to his officials that the reason is, "Can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God?" Even Pharaoh, a foreign king who probably didn't know much about the God Joseph serves, can see the light of that God shining from him. He can tell this guy is different because of how he speaks and how he acts. And so Joseph steps into his final, up to today, role, goes from the humble wise man to the Pharaoh's advisor. Pretty big promotion. Okay, now I told you I can relate to this story and to how Joseph changes over his young adulthood. So this is the part where you get to hear about some phases of my life. First, age 17. At 17, I was Rachel, the confident dreamer. I had planned out my whole future based on this little idea that my high school job, my boss at the time, who I really admired, she suggested this idea, and I thought, okay, this is going to allow me, firstly, to be the boss of my own life, and secondly, hopefully, later, I'd be able to be the boss of the business. I had very big dreams. But I was 100% sure that this was what was going to happen. The future was bright. And just like Joseph, that same year was when I reached my first pit, because the same trusted person who had planted the seed of that idea in my life decided suddenly to, instead of promoting me in her business, shut the whole thing down. I found out later that it was because she was kind of in her own life pit, a season of deep grief, but I was 17, and so from my perspective, she was just doing this whole thing to ruin my plans. And I even wondered at times if God was punishing me for something. Unlike Joseph, I was not sold into slavery, thank goodness, but I kind of volunteered for unpaid labor. After all my plans fell apart, I volunteered for the summer at Cape and Ray Harbor, working 14-hour days unpaid, 6 days a week, on their housekeeping team. That's when I became Rachel the worker bee. There I am, in my apron. Not only did I end up loving that job, though, it awakened some new things in me. First was a love for hospitality, a love for serving others, making them feel welcome, making them feel like this is a place they can belong. And secondly was an opportunity to actually live out my faith in Jesus, which up till then had mostly been about having the right answers in Sunday school. I spent the summer there and then attended Bible school there for the year and then volunteered another summer there and came home with a whole new trajectory. I remember my family saying, because in the pit I had been pretty grumpy, and then I came home smiling all the time, and they were like, "Who are you?" So that was a significant change. Now, I definitely did not go to prison. That's not a parallel between Joseph and me. But I did go through a time of learning to listen to God's voice in my life. After another setback in my college years, I felt lost. I wasn't really sure who I was, but looking back, I would call this phase Rachel the Searcher. I switched programs at college over and over and over. I kept coming up with new life plans, just trying things on. I traveled. That's a picture of me and my sister in Scotland. And in that time of searching, because I was trying just about everything, I decided to volunteer in my church's youth group. It was my old pastor who suggested this, and it really made no sense to me because when I was in youth group, I hated it. But I really liked my pastor. He was pretty smart. He knew me really well. So I said, okay, I'll give it a try. At least then I'll have one thing a week on my calendar to be like purposeful about. And I think I can definitely see, probably you can all see how that decision at that time of searching led me to where I am today. First through exploring youth ministry as a volunteer, and then becoming part-time staff at that church, going to Bible college, and eventually entering my current phase of life, Rachel the pastor. So we've got these stories. Joseph's story, my own story. His is more dramatic. But I think that we can learn from looking back on his life, looking back on your own lives, and thinking about what your trajectory has been, how you've gotten to this point where you are, and what's ahead of you. So, 3 lessons I want to highlight. First, as long as you live, you will go through ups and downs, phases of struggle and joy. There's just no way around it. I think that sometimes, especially for those of us who are fortunate enough to be born and raised in Canada, we can slip into thinking that we're owed lives of constant comfort. This is even more true of some approaches to Christianity, where faith is seen as a transaction or a trade we're making with God. If I go to church and I give my offering each week, God will reward me with an easy life. That is just plain untrue. It's untrue of life in general because this world is unpredictable and chaotic, but it's also untrue because if you choose to follow Jesus, Jesus followers are called to work for justice in an unjust world and to go against the trends of our world, which can make things very uncomfortable. So, question to reflect on is, how might God be asking you to step outside of your comfort zone? Secondly, God's faithfulness and blessing in our lives will almost never look the way we expect it to. At 17, both Joseph and I thought we knew what our lives were going to look like, and we were both extremely wrong. I thought that my boss, saying I had some potential as a leader who could maybe handle some more responsibility, meant that she was going to hand me her business. And by 25, I would just be running the show. Joseph thought that his dreams were God telling him that without him having to do any work, he was just going to be in charge of his whole family and they would all be bowing down to him. In reality, those were just glimpses into much more complicated paths. I would eventually step into more leadership roles and take on lots more responsibility, but not running a small business. And we've already seen how Joseph's path to leadership had some major plot twists. So another thing to reflect on is, do you have a vision for your life? And is it one that God is showing you a little more each day, or one that you have tried to take full control of? Lastly, I very much believe that the more we become aware of God working in our lives, the clearer our own purpose will become. With each stage of life, we see Joseph struggle. We read that God is with him, and we see him become a little bit more the man God created him to be. Step a little bit more into the picture from the dream when he was young. You can see it in how he handles his dreams and the dreams of others. With his own dreams at 17, he uses them to get attention and make himself feel important. He kind of uses them to push his brothers down. He doesn't think about what he might have to do along the way, assuming it's all going to come easily. Then, after some pits and some learning, he's in prison. He interprets dreams, but doesn't claim it as his own talent, saying it's God's work. And then with Pharaoh, he embraces his role as the one God speaks through and goes beyond just interpreting the dreams to advising Pharaoh in the wise way forward, the whole time pointing to God's power and purpose. The path from the full of himself kid to the humble leader is one of listening to God's leading, noticing God's nudges, and being willing to set aside visions of personal power and glory. So where do you see God's hand at work in your life? And where might God be leading you to learn and grow in the next season? Before I wrap this up, I wanted to point out one more thing about Joseph's story, which is that if we wanted to, we could stop here. We could call this Joseph's happily ever after. Because he's gone from being his father's spoiled favorite child, lording his privileges over his family, to a humble leader who gives Yahweh, the God he serves, all the credit for his gifts. He is finally remembered, pulled out of his latest pit, and elevated to a place of leadership. But he understands his role in all of it is a God-given one that comes with a God-given purpose to bless others. Joseph is as close to on top of the world as you can get at the end of today's chapter. That would make a great story and a great happy ending. But this isn't happily ever after. We're only halfway through this series. It's far from the end of Joseph's story. And I think that is because the big conflict of Joseph's life isn't the injustice he faced and had to overcome. It's not how his power and position was taken away from him and he had to fight to get it back. The main conflict in Joseph's story is that his relationships with his family are broken. Like Becky showed us in her sermon that opened this series, the pits of life almost always bring a loss of relationship. And where we end today, those relationships are still lost. There hasn't been any reconciliation. And there can't be a happily ever after without it. So we end on a bit of a cliffhanger. Everything is going Joseph's way, but when he faces his next challenge, will he respond like the wise leader he has become? Or will he default back, like is so easy to do, to the 17-year-old who loved bragging about ranking higher than his brothers, now that he actually does rank higher than them? Well, there's only one way to find out. You have to come back to our next service or catch the live stream when Ed will walk us through Joseph's next chapter.